Rev up your engines! Today I'm going to talk about an illegal modification that people used to do all the time on cars to make them run better. And that has to do with removing the EGR valve. Now on my Matrix here, it doesn't have an EGR valve. But I didn't remove it illegally. It didn't have one in the first place because it's a more advanced design. Now EGR valves are anti-pollution devices. Stands for exhaust gas recirculation valve. When they first put catalytic converters on cars, when they put the catalytic converters to burn pollutants, what happened was they got too hot, because as they burned the pollutants, sometimes they'd get red hot, burning the on-burn hydrocarbons, and things just got too hot. So engineers started scrambling, how can we make the combustion temperature get lower? Well, they did it by reducing the amount of oxygen going into the engine. Realize that if you add an inert gas into the combustion chamber, then it can't burn as well and it won't get as hot. Now they could have done something like put a canister of nitrogen that's an inert gas and have that added to the engine, but of course that would have to be refilled. You know, Americans weren't going to be refilling them. So they came up with this bizarro compromise, the EGR valve. This bolts to the exhaust. The EGR valve takes exhaust gas, and the old ones like this used a vacuum valve that would open it up when it was needed, and the exhaust gas was then routed into the engine. Now you might think, why the heck would you put exhaust gas into your engine? It's the stuff coming out. Well, exhaust gas is already burnt gas. It's mainly inert. So, sounds weird, but it's true. Adding this somewhat hot exhaust gas into the engine actually made it burn at a lower temperature. Even though it was a warm gas, it didn't have oxygen in it. Well, a tiny bit of oxygen, but mostly oxygen was gone. So, it was more or less an inert gas, so when it went inside the engine, it made the temperatures go low. So the catalytic converters didn't overheat. When I was a young mechanic, we used to see those babies glowing cherry red. Now in the case of this old Toyota, here's the EGR tube right here. You see that tube? That tube comes from the exhaust and goes up, connects to the EGR valve here. When the engine computer decides that it needs to send some exhaust gas to the engine to cool it down, it opens up and exhaust gas goes into the intake and is sucked inside the engine. And that reduced the temperature inside the engine, so it didn't create oxides of nitrogen, which is a deadly pollution for humans. Got rid of leaded gasoline, because the lead pollutes and hurts people. Catalytic converters, originally, they're supposed to burn on-burn hydrocarbons that are bad for you, but they were burning so hot, they were creating these oxides of nitrogen that created a different type of pollution. So they traded one pollution for another with the first catalytic converter system. So these old-fashioned simple EGR valves kept them from creating all these oxides of nitrogen. It was adding an inert gas, which made the combustion temperature get lower, so the catalytic converters wouldn't get hot enough inside to create these oxides of nitrogen. All in good from a theoretical standpoint, but I'm sure you realize I'm going to tell you in the practical world things work differently. The original EGR valves were somewhat fallible. They broke down a lot. The rubber would rip because it's got a rubber diaphragm. Well, hey, all that heat is going to destroy the diaphragm, right? And the tiny little holes inside, they would get carbon in them, and sometimes they would jam wide open. If they jammed wide open, then the exhaust gas was going in the engine all the time. It would run really poorly. And then here again, they would create more and different types of pollution because the engine wasn't running right. Back in the day, I should make their own fix. They'd take the EGR valve off, and there's a gasket here. They would just make a solid aluminum gasket, bolted over the hole so the EGR valve wasn't connected anymore, and that was the end of any problems with the EGR system. Now the vehicle would run better then, but of course it would also pollute more. But back in the day, nobody checked the pollution. There weren't inspection stations every year where you went in to get the pollution system tested to see how much your car polluted. None of that even existed, so guys would just block them up and drive on their merry way. Now if you wanted to check these old ones, they were pretty simple. You put a vacuum gauge on here, you give it vacuum, and if it lost vacuum and fell down and didn't stay up, the diaphragm was ripped and you'd have to buy a new one. And another simple test was to just take the hose off, put a vacuum gauge on here, start the car. Then when you gave it vacuum, it would open. If it opened, the car would start to stumble at idle, and then when you took the hose off and it stopped stumbling, you'd know the thing was working up and down. But as I said, since some of the after effects of burning gasoline is carbon, the carbon could often carbon up these valves and they would stick. So you could physically take them off. You saw carbon. You could spray them with really good cleaner. Carburetor cleaners are what were used in those days. There's better cleaners today, but we use carburetor cleaner, and you got the chunks off, it would work again. And the GM ones are so bad and so notorious that they actually put a screen over this little hole here so that the carbon pieces couldn't get inside, because they were so poorly made, the engines and the whole car, as a matter of fact, that when chunks of carbon would break off, and they often did, they clogged the valve up. So they put a screen in there to try to prevent that. Of course, that was a stopgap measure, because if enough pieces broke off, they'd just clog the screen, and then it wouldn't work right either. And speaking of nutty designs, GM later had electric solenoid EGR valves. It had 3 electric solenoids that would work to open and close the EGR valve by computer controlled, and those systems were always breaking. Some of those valves are 300 something bucks a piece. And since they do bolt onto the exhaust part of the engine so exhaust can come through, all that heat and then cold in the winter and then heat when the engine heated up, they would often rust on solid, making it almost impossible to get them off. A lot of them were like this Toyota, where they had an EGR pipe that screwed on, and a pipe invariably would rot away, or when you tried to change it, the nut would be rusted on solid. When you pulled it, it would just break off in your hands. So it could be a real pain in the butt changing these things out on an old car. So I'm happy that my Toyota here doesn't have an EGR valve. But I didn't break the law taking it off. They didn't build them with EGR valves. So is Toyota polluting more now? No, actually they're polluting less, because it's a completely different design. It doesn't use EGR valves in the first place. As you can see, this says VVT-I, 16 valve. And what that means is that this Toyota engine has a variable valve timing system. That system is all computer run, that the cars no longer need EGR valves to stop the pollution from being created. They don't create oxides of nitrogen by the design of the valve system. Since a straight cam with no variable valve timing has one cam setting and that's it, at certain speeds it would pollute more. So to stop that heat and pollution, on went the EGR valve. But take a modern variable valve timing engine, it has timing that can vary. The computer can set it for different situations. So it does not create the heat in the combustion chamber that requires an EGR valve to stop oxides of nitrogen from being created in the catalytic converter. And yeah, it's super high-tech technology. There's no arguing that. But you take a vehicle like this Toyota, they make such good variable valve timing systems, they rarely have a problem. Take engines like Nissan and BMW. As they age, they're notorious for having variable valve timing problems. And if you think it's something to buy a $300 EGR valve that some of these Chevys had when they went to the electronic EGR valves, wait till you see what it costs to fix a VVT system in a Nissan. You can spend thousands on that, which is yet another reason why you want to change your oil regularly in a modern car. You don't have problems with that variable valve timing system. Engine oil is cheap. Variable valve designs are very expensive to fix. And of course, it's also a reason you want to pick the right car in the first place. Because if you see a manufacturer has had problems with the variable valve timing systems in any of their engines, do not buy one of those cars. Because of pollution control, government regulations, it's never going to go to the past when cars were simple and easy and cheap to fix. You're going to buy a modern car, it's going to have variable valve timing on it. Just make sure you pick one that has a solid, reliable system and not one that breaks down too early. High technology. It's great when it works, but it isn't when it breaks. So you want to buy high technology that has high reliability. Just really make sure of that when you buy a car these days. Or of course you could be like me and drive a lower technology car. Now that thing's still fuel injected, but it has an infinitely lower level of technology than any modern car, 26 years old. So now you know all about the lowly EGR valve, how it came into being, and how now it's pretty much gone extinct. And how if you have a modern car with variable valve timing, you'll pretty much be wasting your time trying to find where it is, because the engines don't even have one on them anymore. So if you never want to miss another one of my new car repair videos, remember to ring that bell.